Good afternoon. It's such an honor to be here. My name is Kate Gunning. I'm a strategy director at GSD&M. I lead the strategy work for the United States Air Force, the United States Space Force, the Air Force Reserve, and the Air National Guard. And never in a million years did I think I'd say this, but military marketing has become a bit of my bread and butter, and I actually really love it. It's amazing. So when the Ad Council approached us about an opportunity to work on a campaign for veterans, I jumped at the chance. And now, a year and a half later, I'm here at StratFest for the first time, about to present our award-winning campaign with our amazing client, Meghan.
Hi, everyone. My name is Meghan Moloney. I work at the Ad Council on our mental health initiative, and I have the honor of working with Kate, the GSD&M team, and our team at the VA on our Veterans Crisis Prevention campaign. This campaign ultimately works to address veteran suicide, which is, of course, a huge issue, but we're really honored to share some of the ways we're making a difference in that space. So just a quick content warning, we will be chatting about suicide and suicide prevention today. If that's something you're not in the headspace to hear, please feel free to step out now or at any time. So just to first set the stage about what the veteran suicide space is right now and what the issue is that we're looking at. Tragically, right now, an average of 17 of our nation's veterans are dying by suicide every day. Even one suicide, of course, is one too many, and this stat always makes us emotional because it's just so heartbreaking. And veteran suicide is, of course, not a new issue, but we look at the ways it's been changing over the last many years. And in the last couple of decades, it actually has grown and grown. We're making a difference in the last few years. The numbers are starting to decline. But since 9/11, there's actually been a 10-fold increase in veteran suicide. So needless to say, this is an issue that really demands our attention. And suicide is not unique to the veteran communities. Unfortunately, many of us have been impacted by it, whether we're veterans or civilians. But we do pay a special attention to the veteran community because the rate of suicide deaths among veterans is much higher than non-veteran adults. You can see the graph here. That blue line is the veteran suicide rate. It's currently sitting at about 71% higher than non-veteran adults. And as you can see, that differential has grown tremendously over the last 20 years. So it's very clear this is an incredibly large issue. It's something that really urgently demands our attention. But the good news here, and what we'll focus on more so, is that there is hope in this space. Public health experts agree that suicide is completely preventable. And so we'll chat about today how we're using communications to play a small role in addressing that. So one thing just to know about the suicide space. We spend a lot of time researching it, what goes into suicide, what are risk factors, and we learn a lot, Kate and I and our teams, from suicide prevention experts. So just a few things to know that might help you kind of understand the work. So there are many, many different risk factors for suicide. It is not just about mental health issues. And veterans, what they might be dealing with are the same things that any of us are dealing with. Things like physical and mental health challenges, financial stresses, things like troubles with housing, jobs, relationships, you name it. It's the same stressors civilians are facing as well. But one thing we see that's a bit different in the veteran community is an added layer of stigma that many folks are facing, especially due to their military training. So we do see among veterans that they're more likely to admit, it's harder for them to admit sometimes that they're struggling, and harder for them to actually reach out and ask for help when the time comes. So this is where GSD&M came in. We tasked them with, actually one more add, I think, on the risk factors that I'll just point out is that when we start to look at where communications can actually come in, of course, suicide it impacts every facet of our lives. We need to be looking at health and mental health resources, all the things. So as advertisers, where can we actually plug in here? What can we actually do? And one thing we really are going to address, and you'll hear a lot more about this from Kate, is getting in early and combating that stigma early on. So we want to help veterans access help well before anything in their life reaches a crisis point. So when the first moment that they're having trouble with a job or having trouble with housing, we need them to be accessing the VA resources that exist, plentyfold, there, accessing that help before anything becomes more of a crisis down the road. So GSD&M, our task for them was really to come in here and create a PSA that's going to address that stigma, encouraging veterans to proactively reach out for help, ultimately leading to our goal to prevent veteran suicide.
Yeah, so pretty amazing brief and just an unbelievably daunting task. And two other things kind of made me nervous just between us strategists in the room. The first was that we were handed a brand platform that was already existing. They had developed it with a previous agency. It's a brilliant one, don't wait, reach out, and it was also serving as the tagline, but it's never easy when you didn't birth the brand platform yourself and you have to kind of figure out how to exist within that existing sandbox. And then the second was they had worked with a previous agency that developed an unbelievably kind of haunting spot called The Boil that I probably think about once a week, and it gives me chills every time I think about it. And I was like, how will we ever top this last agency's spot? I didn't link it in here, but it is in the resources if you guys want to watch it. It's unbelievable. And it's called The Boil, and it's about the parable of what happens when you put a frog in boiling water. So if you put a frog in boiling water, it'll jump out and survive. If you put a frog in room temperature water and turn it up, it'll stay put and just slowly die. So just an unbelievably visceral analogy to what it feels like when you're having a mental health crisis and when you're slowly reaching potentially a tipping point towards suicide. So they did an amazing job, and we didn't quite know where to go from there, to be honest. But when we talked to the ad council, we kind of talked about what that work did really well, which was it really shined a light on the problem and what it feels like when you're going through that crisis. And what we wanted to do strategically was actually focus more on what it looks like when you start to take steps towards a solution to the problem. So that was kind of our strategic shift. And then creatively, nothing could ever top the way that The Boil makes you feel when you watch it, trust me. But we wanted to create some work that really makes you and encourages veterans to ultimately take action. And at the end of the day, that was what we kept in mind as we were going through the entire strategic process was we have to get more veterans to reach out for help, specifically through the VA. So we started with a whole bunch of research, and one of the very first stats that I read was that 50% of vets who die by suicide have never actually interacted with the VA. And so this was an interesting stat to stumble upon, and we started to dig into the why. So I thought, since it's a room full of strategists, I'll kind of walk you through our strategic process with this, because it was hefty, and we had kind of a 5-step process. I'll talk a little bit about a literature review, which was there's a whole body of research around veteran suicide that we felt like we really had to get smart on. We had access to suicide prevention expert interviews, which was unbelievably powerful in kind of getting us to wrap our heads around the topic. We did some amazing focus groups and in-depth interviews with veterans, which is really where we had our kind of aha moment with the campaign. The whole time through, we're doing kind of social listening to understand the conversation and the culture around this topic. And then we did some concept testing. It was really important that we put different options in front of not just our ad council clients, but the VA as well as veterans to see which one is actually going to encourage them to take action. So I'll just give you some highlights from each of those 5 steps. So when we dug into the body of literature, it just gave us kind of an overwhelming sense of the breadth and depth of the epidemic, and really some interesting data around the age demographic specifically. So what we've seen is that the older population accounts for the bulk of the suicide deaths. So you'll see that 60+ number, which is super, super high and devastating. But we're actually seeing a higher rate of suicide among younger veterans, specifically ones who are just starting to make that transition from their military life into their civilian life. It's an unbelievably difficult transition, and unfortunately one that many don't make it through. In the conversations with the suicide prevention experts, it gave us a really interesting understanding of the audiences. There's not just one type of veteran, and so the vets who are dealing with the challenges living in a rural community are very different than the vets who are kind of entering the civilian world as an LGBTQ plus member. And so we started to wrap our heads around all these different audiences, and it was like, okay, we have to create something that's going to resonate with all of them when they're dealing with such different challenges. And then we got into the focus groups and interviews, which, per usual, were unbelievably insightful. We learned so much. I think a couple of things that stood out. The first is that the biggest and strongest barrier for them is that most veterans actually feel this overwhelming sense of guilt about not being a real veteran. And so in all of these quotes, you'll see, they show up to the VA, they fill out this intake form, and some of the first questions that they have to answer are, have you been shot? Have you experienced an IED? And when the answers are no, they start to feel like, okay, maybe I shouldn't be here. Maybe I'm not like a real veteran and I don't deserve the resources. Similarly, with this veteran, John, he was in the Marine Corps and he was never actually deployed, and he just felt a lot of guilt over the fact that he was struggling with his mental health, but he wasn't even deployed, and his men and women who served were not necessarily experiencing that. The second thing that we found is that vets really firmly believe that their personal emotional struggles should be these lonely solo battles that are kind of theirs to combat. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that they do have a sense of pride in, I've been through all of these horrible things, I can get through this on my own, and I don't need to reach out for support. And so the aha moment actually didn't come in what we heard, but it was an observation that we made as we were kind of observing the behavior of the veterans who were showing up to these different pieces of research. And what we found is that veterans were actually more likely to show up for their focus groups when they knew that other veterans were counting on them than they were to their in-depth interviews, proving this kind of hunch that we had, which was that their sense of service to others is a lot more stronger and a lot more motivating than their sense of service to self. And so that drove the insight, and it was this idea that no battle is ever fought alone, and they know this better than anyone else, and maybe we just very simply need to remind them of the most valuable thing that they learned in the military, which is the power of teamwork. Like, you can't do it alone. We picked this image very purposely. This is from a ritual that's done at the Naval Academy every year among the freshmen or the plebes, and they're basically told you have to climb this 21-foot monument that's covered in baby oil and soap and get the hat that's sitting on the top and do it as quickly as possible. And they're not given any instruction, and the only way that they can actually do it is if they rely on each other. They build these kind of giant human pyramids, and they're timed. So the quickest that they've ever done it is like a minute, and the longest that it took was 4 hours. But it was just a great example of, like, you have to rely on each other in order to succeed. And so that ultimately drove the strategic idea. We wanted to kind of flip the script and actually make the act of reaching out feel really, really courageous, and use the creative to challenge veterans to do for themselves what they are constantly doing for other people.
So the creative we ended up with ended up being a very simple idea and production approach, but it was super powerful. So we just sat down with veterans and had them talk to us. And of course, what we heard, as we expected, a lot of just hearing about their life since service is centered around what they're doing for others, how they're present to their families, how they're involved in their communities. It was a constant, like, here's all the things I do. And we ended the interview with a question for them. When was the last time you asked for help for yourself? And working with the director, Catherine Bigelow, who you might be familiar with, an Academy Award winner, we captured these just really powerful reactions that veterans had to that question of realizing that this power of teamwork, that it's so ingrained in them. They're the first to be there for others. Service before self is how the Air Force puts it in their mantra. That is a deeply held belief. And when they put themselves in the shoes of someone who needs help, someone on their team, and it's just an immediate realization that maybe it's time for them to ask for help themselves. We can skip one more. So, of course, with any ad campaign, it was a 360 campaign across all media. Here are some of the placements it showed up. We at the Ad Council operate on a donated media model, and we've received in the year since this launch over $11 million in media support from our partners for this campaign. We're super proud of that, as well as some big national press hits. We've got the Secretary of the VA involved in the launch. He was so proud of the work. And then, of course, pickup's great, but what did it actually do? What difference did it make? Some stats for you here. I'll just note on the website sessions is one of the things we look at in particular because the ultimate goal is getting veterans help. And we have a repository of resources for vets that we've kind of custom made to be easy to navigate because the VA is always complex. So we've got 4 million vets in this year looking at the website and a third of vets being aware of that repository. And we're going to just close on our core KPI, if you will, our most important number. We're able to project that 2.8 million veterans who are struggling have both seen our PSAs and have reached out for help. So it's kind of a multi-step stat there, but our core audience of folks who are struggling, having seen the work and reported reaching out for help. So that's a 100% increase from the year prior. Obviously, it's super important. And overall, we're just really honored to get to do this work, to be a small part of the solution, and ultimately to get to see how advertising and communications can address some of our most pressing issues. Thank you.
Thank you.